The 1920s was a very exciting time in lacrosse and in the nation. World War I had just ended and people were very hopeful for a better future for themselves and their children. Men were coming back from the front. Farm fields were full of workers again and the factories were starting to chug out materials. All kinds of different things were happening. People were looking forward to a happier time nationally. The worst effects of the 1918 pandemic were behind the nation, though it continued to be a threat and affect many lives throughout the 20s. We also have prohibition going on at the same time. Locally, this had a big impact as the local breweries, of course, couldn't make beer anymore. So a lot of them switched to near beer or they switched to soft drinks. Taverns as well also had that issue. They either went to soft drinks, they closed up, or most likely they had a speakeasy in the back room. Agriculture at this time is still a mainstay of the economy of La Crosse County and the whole region, and this was mainly made up of family farms. So we start to see more mechanization on the farms, more technology, but it's still a lot of labor by hand and relying on other people to help out during certain times of the year. Farm life was very hard work. There wasn't much assistance except from neighbors, friends, and family. If crops failed or they didn't thrive in a season, it could have disastrous results on livestock and farm families. So lots of lives were dependent on the success of the family farm from year to year.
Nick and Ellen Beeson are farmers on Brinkman Ridge. They're in their mid-30s. Brinkman Ridge is on the La Crosse County and Vernon County line. Newspapers reports say it was about 3 miles north of Coon Valley in the town of Greenfield. Gertrude is the teenage daughter of Nick and Helen Beeson, the oldest of 5 children. John Byer is a 21-year-old farmhand on the Beeson farm, and he is related to Helen through marriage. Her brother married John's sister.
Gertrude, we know, was already working in the fields at age 11 for a neighbor, so it's assumed that she probably would have had farming responsibilities from a very early age in the fields, as well as doing some other tasks such as watching the younger children. Perhaps she collected eggs from the chickens, milked the cows. I would think that she would have had a pretty good working relationship with the farm.
Having grown up on a farm in the 1980s and 1990s myself, it seems like life on a farm has always been stressful and always will be stressful. So late 1910s, early 1920s would have been no different. While certain technologies would have been making the work easier for the Beesons than, say, their parents' generation, the increased productivity and efficiency of that would have probably added complications as well. I don't really want to speculate on what we don't know, but the information that came out after the wild events of the summer of 1920 would lead anyone to believe that there must have been a lot of tension in the Beeson household and probably had been for several years. It was later noted after all the events of 1920 that Nick had been living in the barn for 2 years, and so he would have started living in the barn probably around 1918. The relationship between Nick and John was also probably pretty volatile. They worked together for several years, with Byer being the farmhand on the Beeson farm, but they quarreled often, and they often quarreled about Helen. And this may be one of the reasons why Nick started living in the barn. Gertrude also noticed strange things happening around the house at this time. Her mother would leave the kitchen with a platter of food and it would come back to the kitchen empty. She also said that she heard footsteps around the house as though someone was pacing back and forth, but she didn't know who.
The headline on August 27, 1920 of the La Crosse Tribune starts to set the chain of events.
The headline is, "Asks wife to get strawberries, then blows out brains." And the article goes on to say, Nick Beeson, age 37, farmer on Brinkman's Ridge just this side of the La Crosse County line, went into the kitchen of his home about 1:30 yesterday, told his wife to go out and pick him some strawberries, and while she was on an errand, blew the top of his head off with a double-barreled shotgun. Despondency and worry over financial trouble is the only reason that relatives can assign. Mrs. Beeson told the coroner and Undersheriff Ed Miller, who were summoned, that she had left for the strawberry patch pursuant to her husband's request. She heard a shot and returned to the house calling, "Nick, Nick." The body was discovered a short time later by his daughter. The deceased is survived by a widow and 5 children, all minors. There's no indication from the one article regarding Nick's suicide how Gertrude or the other Beeson children reacted. The newspaper makes it seem as though there was no question it was a suicide, so police involvement at this point was pretty minimal as far as we can tell.
Nick was buried in Mormon Coulee Cemetery, which is now Trinity United Church of Christ in the town of Shelby.
So less than a month after Nick Beeson's death, the Beeson farmhouse was destroyed in a fire. Helen awoke in the middle of the night and found the house in flames, only just barely making out alive. Newspapers reported that she and her 2-year-old son Alvin were forced to plunge through a wall of fire to make their escape, and they were badly burned. So you have the suicide of Nick Beeson, then the farmhouse burns down less than a month later. All the while, there have been years of tension in the household, leading to many fights between Nick and Helen, Nick and farmhand John Beyer, all the weird things going on in the house that Gertrude and others were seeing. So 14-year-old Gertrude probably didn't really have all the facts about what was happening around her, and I'm sure she was very distraught. She turned to her uncle, an uncle on her father's side, Joseph Lamke, and probably laid it all out to him.
She tells him about all of the fighting that she's overheard over many years, mainly over the relationship between her mom, Helen, and the farmhand Beyer. And the uncle actually is the one who brings it to the court's attention.
Gertrude's uncle took the stories Gertrude told him seriously, and they may have confirmed things that he knew himself, confirmed rumors that he had heard from neighbors, and he reported all these things to the local authorities. A month after the farmhouse fire and 2 months after Nick's death, John Beyer was arrested and charged with a statutory offense, basically having an inappropriate relationship with a married woman. The court case regarding the statutory offense of John Beyer with Helen Beeson is when all the dirty laundry from the Beeson household over the years saw the light of day for the first time. The papers reported Helen's name directly, so if rumors of their years-long affair hadn't spread far yet, it was now in the La Crosse Tribune. Gertrude was put on the stand and told the court about everything she'd seen and heard over the years, the fights, that her father had been living in the barn for 2 years, some of the strange things that were happening in her house. Everything that she had told to her uncle came out in court that day.
So John is out on bail awaiting the result of his court case regarding the statutory offense, and Helen has yet to be charged with anything. And in the meantime, this fire investigation starts to come to the forefront. Local officials suspected arson in this particular case just because of the suicide of Nick Beeson, and then all of a sudden, 3 or 4 weeks later, the farmhouse burns down. So arson was suspected in this case, especially since Beyer was in court on this statutory offense. So while listening to the testimony, the Deputy State Fire Marshal came and spent some time in La Crosse doing some investigation. While he was investigating, he found major discrepancies between Beyer's story and Helen's story of what happened during Nick Beeson's suicide.
So this fire investigation is where this whole thing really breaks wide open. The Deputy State Fire Marshal questioned both Helen and Beyer regarding the fire and consequently Nick's earlier suicide. In attempting to simply establish the cause of the fire, he was also investigating the suicide. And the newspapers say that he stumbled across facts which did not fit the suicide explanation of the husband's death put forward by Mrs. Beeson. And so after further questioning both Helen and Beyer, he uncovered other discrepancies in their stories. The newspapers reported that the Deputy State Fire Marshal had barely begun digging further, and Helen broke immediately, confessing that in fact Helen and the farmhand John Beyer were lovers, and that Beyer had killed her husband Nick. In her confession to the Deputy State Fire Marshal, Helen stated that Beyer had told her he had killed Nick in self-defense.
Helen contended that she was still out of the house and returned to the farmhouse upon hearing a gunshot. And when she came in, she found Byer sitting at the kitchen table, looking rather forlorn and saying, "I had to shoot him. It was in self-defense. He was going to kill me." On the advice of his father, Byer decided he was going to go to South Dakota and get away from Helen once and for all. He figured this was the only way to cut clean and start a new life with her out of his life. But when he stopped to say goodbye at the farmhouse, Helen detained him for a few days. It turns out that she was actually constructing a special closet in which to hold him captive, so that nobody would know in the family that he was actually being held there. So during this time, Helen made out of crude pine boards a very small closet, approximately 3.5 feet by 5 feet, just big enough for a bed. Of course, John was going to South Dakota, so he had a whole trunk full of belongings with him. And in that trunk, he had a revolver. But she insisted that he stay in the closet, and she basically kept him as a captive so he could share her bed in the evenings. Byer at any time could have overpowered Helen, especially having a revolver with him, but yet he still chose to stay there, and he contended that he was still under her spell, that he just couldn't get away from her, that he was in love, and so he just did what she told him to. So local authorities decided that they needed to know once and for all how exactly Nick died, if they could assume that. The only way to do that was to dig up the body, to exhume the body from the cemetery and do an investigation.
Well, nothing definitive came from the exhumation in terms of Byer's guilt or whether it was actually self-defense, which is what they were looking for. The different means of suicide that were originally thought with how Nick died were definitely ruled out.
Byer pleaded guilty to first-degree murder after his confession, and Helen was found guilty on the charge of adultery. Byer was sentenced to life in prison at Waupun State Prison for the rest of his natural life, and Helen winds up also at Waupun State Prison for adultery, and her sentence is 2 years. After Byer's sentencing, the sheriff leads him to a room where Helen is, and this is the first time that they've seen each other now for quite some time. They stared in each other's eyes, according to the newspaper report, and their passion just seemed to build up. And finally, the Sheriff Lund said that they could go ahead and embrace and kiss one last time. This would probably be the last time they would have that opportunity. And then Helen begs Byer, "I'll be true to you no matter what happens to me." And she begged him to be true to her. Probably one of the most pathetic love scenes ever enacted in the La Crosse County Jail was the parting of Mrs. Helen Beeson and John G. Byer. Within a few minutes after he confessed in circuit court that he had murdered Nick Beeson, Brinkman Ridge farmer, and had been sentenced to life imprisonment, Byer was on his way back to jail, there to await the time of departure for the prison at Waupun.
Eight years pass with Byer in prison, enough time that La Crosse citizens may have forgotten the drama of 1920. Headlines in 1928 start coming again. It seems Byer has been thinking about the events with the Beeson family, and he determined that he had been pressured into the guilty plea on the murder charge and that it really hadn't gone down the way that it came out in court. One would assume that Byer had lots of time to think in prison. His feelings toward Helen likely changed, and he probably began to understand what a weird and unfortunate situation he had been put in as a very young man. His relationship with Helen started when he was maybe just 17. He realized that he had actually been kidnapped and held captive against his will by Helen, and he called it being a love slave. Ultimately, he repudiated his own confession from 8 years earlier.
John had been taking extension courses, he had bettered himself, and of course he had grown up a lot. You have to remember that this relationship started when he was just a minor, and he was 21 when he was sent to prison. So he had a lot of time to think about things. I think that he may have just felt that he wanted to clear his conscience and have a fresh start in life, and that this would be a way to do it, would be to get a pardon and have his citizenship actually restored.
Between 1920 and 1928, there were court proceedings involving Byer and a possible pardon. Attempts were being made to formulate a case to show that Helen was the real murderer instead of John Byer. 2 years prior to this, when the pardon proceedings started, Byer formally repudiated his confession and blamed Helen for the death of her husband, Nick. Because of this, she was brought into custody in 1928 to be questioned, and as the papers reported, she was going to be confronted by Byer.
Byer's lawyer attempted to give him a reprieve so he could come and actually get Helen to confess that she was the one who committed the murder and not John.
So Byer was brought from Waupun State Prison to La Crosse to participate in these proceedings. This was all blessed by the governor, Governor Zimmerman, and Byer was granted a 5-day parole in order for him to seek evidence upon which he hoped to regain his freedom to get out of prison. The governor sanctioned the release of Byer on this parole in order that he might participate as a surprise witness in an attempt to jar from Helen a confession that she, after all, was her husband's killer and not just Byer. Questioning of Helen really went nowhere as her story remained consistent from years prior. We don't really know if Byer was able to confront Helen on this, but Helen was released and Byer was sent back to Waupun to continue serving his life sentence for the murder of Nick Beeson. Before getting back to Waupun to continue serving his life sentence, Byer's lawyer somehow managed a meeting with the governor during this 5-day parole for Byer. At this meeting, the governor was presented with a statement from Byer pleading his innocence. In this statement, Byer contends that he was a slave, locked against his will in a specially constructed closet of the farmhouse when he had determined he was going to leave town. When she could, Mrs. Beeson would bring her young lover table scraps and water so that he could shave and clean up. She let him out nights to share her bed after her husband retired. During a period of 4 months being locked in the closet, Byer overheard many arguments between Nick and Helen. During one of these fights, on the night of the murder, Byer claimed he heard another argument between husband and wife and that Mrs. Beeson cried out to John for help. It was at this point young Byer broke out of his closet, encountered Beeson, who was armed with a butcher knife, and shot him in the forehead with a revolver in self-defense. Byer says that he fired the shot from the pistol which struck Beeson in the forehead and that he fell backwards and lay perfectly motionless for a couple of minutes, during which time Mrs. Beeson came in from the outside, handed him the shotgun and said, "Shoot him again." It is very probable that Beeson was actually dead or near dead when the second shot was fired. If so, the murder had already been committed when she handed the shotgun to Byer to fire the second shot. It seems to us that for these reasons, it would be quite impossible to convict her as an accessory after the fact. After Byer's meeting with the governor, the district attorney had a private consultation with the governor in which the attorney general recommended leniency in the pardon consideration, as Byer had already served 8 years on a murder which was now believed to have been at least partially prompted by the dead man's wife, Helen. The district attorney had come to believe Byer when he said the first shot was self-defense and that the second shot was prompted by Helen, even though Nick was probably killed by the first shot. In January of 1929, right before his term as governor ended, Governor Zimmerman commuted Byer's sentence of life to 14 years, thereby making him eligible for parole. Byer was freed on parole a month later.
So Helen was never convicted of any wrongdoing, although it seemed like she did have some kind of involvement in her husband's death, but nothing was ever proven. She wasn't sentenced for any time with that. She did serve her 2 years at the Waupun State Prison for adultery, but never served any time in connection with her husband's death.
Helen regains custody of her youngest child in the 1920s, and that child lived with her and her second husband. She later tried to reconnect with some of her children by sending gifts and letters to them. The gifts and letters that she tried to send were her attempt at trying to regain their trust and regain a relationship with them, but she claims after the affair that all of that really ruined her relationship with her children.
And so she really, I don't think, had much communication with her children after this.
With a dead father and a mother in prison, the 5 Beeson children were split up and sent to live with family in 1920. By 1930, all of the children were out on their own. Gertrude was married. The next 2 oldest children were hired by with farms in the area. One of the children ends up in Iowa, but most of the children lived out their lives in La Crosse and Vernon counties. When Helen was released from her 2-year prison term for adultery, she married Reinhold Bardovic, to whom she was married in 1928 when the case against her reopened for the murder of her first husband, Nick. They split a few years later. She married a 3rd time in the 1940s to Reuben Gorel. Upon parole and reinstatement of his citizenship, John Byer was still a young man.
He begins a new life. He comes back to the La Crosse area. He's working as a farmer, a painter, and in his later years, a working life as a clerk at Kroner Hardware in downtown La Crosse. He marries a woman, lives to age 84, and he dies in 1983.
Helen is buried in Liberty Pole Cemetery in Vernon County. Byer is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery on La Crosse's south side.